I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, our sponsor, the Great Courses Plus. It's an app that you get on your phone. You just touch the app and it opens right up to hundreds and hundreds of different courses, each of which have a couple dozen lectures. This particular one of my favorites I listen to, is called Understanding the Dark Side of Human Nature. Daniel Brever, PhD, is the lecture. There are a total of 24 lectures. Each of them is about 30 minutes long. I listen to them at 1.2 or 1.3 speed, so you can adjust that, which is nice, and that makes it about a 20-minute lecture, which is perfect for different tasks that you might be doing, just to plow through one or two or three or four lectures, depending on how long you're out and about listening to content. The beautiful thing about the Great Courses Plus program, it's a subscription-based, and so you get access to all of the courses and all of the lectures, and you can just skip around as you so please. So here's the deal. If you sign up through my podcast, you get a you get a free trial and a discount that comes out to about $30 a year, and then that gets you access to that. So what you do is you go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/Shermer to get your free trial and the $30 discount. thegreatcoursesplus.com/Shermer. That's the discount. Okay. My guest today is Helen Pluckrose, is a liberal political and cultural writer and speaker. She is the editor of REO magazine and the author of many popular essays on postmodernism, critical theory, liberalism, secularism, and feminism. A participant in the Grievance Studies Affair probe, which highlighted problems in social justice scholarship, she is today an exile from the humanities, where she researched late medieval and early modern religious writing by and for women. She lives in London, England. Her book that we're discussing today is this, Cynical Theories. You can see critical theories is crossed out. Cynical Theories, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everyone. Okay, so we cover a lot of material. This is a long podcast, but she's one of the most interesting guests I've had. We start off talking about postmodernism and why this was a good thing. Actually, a kind of skepticism of meta-narratives that seemingly gave us objective truths when they didn't. So that was a kind of a good form of skepticism. And then how that, like so many of these ideas that start off with good intentions and good programs, just go too far. So in that sense, we cover not just postmodernism, but also, as she does in the book, that was co-authored with James Lindsay, post-colonial theory, queer theory, critical race theory and intersectionality, feminisms and gender studies, disability and fat studies, social justice and action, and then at the end they present an alternative to the ideology of social justice. So because she's far more liberal politically than I am, we had some interesting back and forth about issues of individualism versus collectivism, about the role of the government or not in individual human affairs, the nature of human nature, and how this often drives ideologies and science. And then we end by talking about race, the use of the N-word, and how we can get past this whole movement, this critical race theory that they talk about, these sort of critical theories in all these different areas, how we can get past this, because the end result of assessing everybody by their skin color or by their race, sex, gender, and so forth cannot come to a good end. I mean, just even a Wikipedia level understanding of history of what happens when one group of people assesses another group of people by their skin color, for example, never ends well. This kind of hierarchical ranking of people based on characteristics they're born with, it cannot have a good ending. And that is exactly what we're in the middle of doing right now. So this kind of ending racism by having more racism and calling it anti-racism or whatever is not going to work. It's just not. We have to get past this. So we end the conversation talking about all that. Anyway, it was one of the most enjoyable conversations I've had. So with that, I give you Helen Pluckrose, and thank you for listening. Helen Pluckrose, thanks for coming on the show. The book is Cynical Theories, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody. So your book came out last August, so you've had a little time to reflect on some of the reviews. Before I get to that, I always like to start my show with a little anecdote or story. So one came up yesterday that's just perfect for this. So I have a little almost 5-year-old boy, and so I'm at the playground with my wife and another couple and their kids here in Santa Barbara. And so some strange guy walks up, I'd never seen him before, with his daughter, and he says to the other couple that we know, you got to check out my op-ed, my letter to the editor in the local paper. This is the Independent, it's the liberal newspaper here in Santa Barbara. And so I'm just sitting there in my chair, and I Googled through my phone, the Independent. So I get on that page, and then he says the name of the letter, just the keywords are Indian wedding. So I searched that, and so here's his open letter to the Independent editors. Quote, I'm a local Santa Barbara songwriter and musician. Last week, the Independent had planned to publish a conversation with me about my new song, Indian Wedding. After I did the interview, I was told that the title, Indian Wedding, might be offensive. So before the Independent could run a picture of the artwork with the song title, I was asked for my racial background. Let me repeat that. Before the Independent would publish the artwork for my single, I was asked what my race was. Apparently, if I answered with what they considered the correct race, then the album art could be posted. If I answered with what they considered the wrong kind of race, then a picture of the artwork would not be printed so as not to offend its readers. Of course, I refused to answer the question, seeing how it was not only irrelevant, but also clearly inappropriate. I just wanted to inform the staff of the Independent that there is a large country in southern Asia called India. In this country, they occasionally have weddings. Also, I believe that the editorial staff at the ironically titled Independent have lost their minds. This is great. But and amazingly, the editors put a note after this. So his name is Todd O'Keefe. As O'Keefe correctly asserts, members of our staff raised concerns his song title could be construed as cultural appropriation. Out of an abundance of caution when it comes to such charges, he was requested to provide another image if he were not of Indian or Native American descent. We regret that he's chosen another route, as we believe our readership would enjoy the new song. I believe this has some relevance for your thesis in your book, that this academically obscure postmodernism movement has trickled down into the real world, all the way down to playgrounds.
Very much so. I think so. I mean, as an editor of a magazine myself, I find myself thinking about this. If I'm choosing an image for a piece, I have to worry about whether I'm picking the right image or not. If I'm talking about some kind of social problem, do I have to have a white person as an image? The only time I think I managed to think, okay, this will be acceptable, was some advocacy of the need to read more novels, and I could then safely feature a black woman reading a novel. But even that now, I think, would be a problem, because as we've recently heard from, was it your Smithsonian Institute or somewhere, literacy is actually white supremacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
well, all of Western cultures, that would include science and reason, but also literature, art, music is a form of white dominance or white supremacy, therefore it's oppression.
I find this particularly worrying, and I know that a lot of people in the UK do too. We are reliant on attracting scientists, engineers and doctors from India, Pakistan and Nigeria. And I can't help wondering how they feel if they arrive and are then informed by a scholar of this kind that this kind of knowledge is not for them. It's pretty racist.
Oh, yes, right. If you told a black person science, say physics, is white science and therefore inappropriate for you, I mean, that would be blatantly racist. You would have thought so. And yet, in a way, that's kind of indirectly what they're doing.
Precisely, and it's completely ahistorical as well. So it's quite frustrating, and I'm not surprised. We're hearing from a lot, particularly Indian people, Sikh and Hindu background, who are really not very happy with this post-colonial narrative.
Yes, right. Well, your book covers a lot of different things: postmodernism, post-colonialism, queer theory, critical race theory, gender studies, and so on. But before we dive into those, so since it's been since August, you've done a ton of media. Your book's been reviewed widely. What has been the reception of the book and your thesis, and how have you responded to that?
So there's been the full range of criticisms, and I've been keeping a careful list of them. And when I get a moment to breathe, I'm going to respond to some of the more reasonable ones. So some of the less reasonable criticisms, obviously, are that we're fascists or white supremacists, or that we should have written about something else, or our book's too complicated, or our book's too reductionist. So that we get a lot of that. But there have been a couple of good criticisms. So if there was to be a second edition of the book, I think a couple of people have said we look so much at how the scholarship evolved, but not why. So I think the book could probably do with an extra chapter of sociological research on why these changes have come about. We're not sociologists, so it's not something I feel confident in making a strong argument for, but I can certainly present some of the strongest arguments that are out there. Some people feel we've neglected the influence of Marxism to some extent, and I think we could probably... That's probably a fair criticism. We could introduce a bit more of how that found its way into particularly critical race theory via the Frankfurt School and the likes of Angela Davis. So there's been a range, but mostly, it's Twitter that I hear from people mostly, and it's just generally people telling me I'm evil in one way or another.
Well, Twitter is probably not the best source for constructive criticism on improving your ideas, for sure. But as I just described, it sounds so blatantly, obviously racist to assess everything based on race. For example, they get, we ask people to show a picture of themselves or tell their race before you're willing to, say, interview them for a newspaper. But surely the smart people that embrace postmodernism today can't be so dumb they don't see that that's racist. So they have something else going on. So let's go back in time, as you do in the book, the first couple chapters on how this stuff developed, and maybe not why it developed, but how. What was its original intention, starting with the French Post-Modernists?
Okay, so in the first place, the first sort of iteration of it in the late 1960s was very much a skepticism and a kind of despair. So we heard from people like Jean-François Lyotard and Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida that there was a great skepticism to the large sort of overarching explanations for how the world worked. So they were critical of Christianity, they were critical of Marxism, but they were also particularly critical of things like science and reason and the whole notion of progress. And you have to sort of understand this in a way, because there had been 2 world wars. Jim Crow had just ended, colonialism had just finished. So, yeah, there was this sense that the world, this sort of a naive version of the Enlightenment project that where everything's always going to get better isn't warranted. But I don't think most people who would consider themselves to be in favour of Enlightenment thinking would say that's that we all assume the world is just going to keep getting better anyway. It will keep getting better if we keep focusing on liberalism, reason, and evidence. That the problems have emerged when we stop doing that. So that they were very, very deconstructive, but they kind of burned themselves out, because once you've deconstructed everything and it's all in a mess, there's not much more you can do. So it was the next wave in the 1990s that became more explicitly politicized and tied to identity. We had this idea then of queer theory, which was looking at the history of sexuality, and it was trying to break down categories of man and woman, male and female, masculine, feminine, gay, straight. Critical race theory took quite a postmodern turn at this stage as well, and started looking very much at attitudes and biases. Feminism kind of disappeared to get swallowed up by aspects of queer theory and intersectionality, which comes from critical race theory at that time. And then we see these strange sort of sub disciplines of things like fat studies and disability studies. And all of them have a kernel of truth. And that's what's so frustrating, because there's something in each of them that actually makes quite a good point, and then it just goes insane, rather than sort of taking this kernel of truth, such as Kimberlé Crenshaw said, black women can experience prejudice for being black women, and it's not really adequately covered as either racism or as sexism. There are stereotypes that accrue to black women in particular, and so this is a valid point, and it's something that could be worked on. But since then, we've seen intersectionality really just sort of spiral into this competitive oppression kind of model, in which you see light-skinned black women being accused of having privilege by darker-skinned black women. And it's got to a stage, and even, Professor Crone-Fox-Shaw herself has said it's got to a stage where it's not really being very useful at all. So it hardened at about 2010. That so much scholarship had been written, it became very sure of itself, and it settled into quite a simplistic dogma now. Now we are just meant to understand that it's objectively true, that knowledge is a construct of power, powerful forces in society tell us what is true, and the rest of us believe it uncritically, and then we just speak into these systems of power, and that perpetuates these oppressive power systems. So we need these kind of critical theorists and activists to make us see these oppressive power systems, and this is where the word woke comes in, because these are the people who believe they can see what the rest of us are blind to, so that we can then start to dismantle the white supremacy and patriarchy that they're convinced underlies everything.
Yeah, you list these different intersectionalities: white versus non-white, male, female, light, dark, cisgender, transgender, heterosexual, homosexual, gender typical, deviant, young, old, European, non-European, Anglophone, English as a second language, Gentile, Jews, rich, poor, fertile, infertile, able-bodied, disabled, credentialed, non-literate. As philosopher Catherine Pauli Morgan explained, intersectionality, each of us may be identified and judged on where we fall, quote, on each of these axes at a minimum, and that this point is simultaneously a locus of our agency, power, disempowerment, oppression, and resistance, close quote. The Chicana feminist activist Elizabeth Martinez worried that such hierarchical assessments might lead to. Quote, there are various forms of working together. A coalition of one is one, a network is another, an alliance is yet another. But the general idea is no competition of hierarchy should prevail, no oppression Olympics. Apparently that's where that term came from. So what I think is interesting here is, again, it seemed like a good idea at the time, maybe going back to the 50s, 60s, or maybe even earlier. And because there are certain truths to these claims that then go too far. So let's go back to what the original claims were, and I'll just use by example. When I entered a doctoral program in the history of science, 1988, the postmodernist movement had kind of infiltrated into the general history profession and then into the history of science. Because before that, say in the 30s, 40s, 50s, people writing the history of science described it as this kind of asymptotic curve that was bending ever upward, inexorably marching toward an understanding of reality with a capital R, and that ultimately we would get to the truth with a capital T through the methods of science. As if this scientific method were operating in a vacuum, a cultural vacuum. And so people like Steve Gould at Harvard, who was first my hero, then my mentor, then my friend, most of his essays that he wrote and his books were all about how socially constructed science can be. It's embedded in a culture. It's so pervasive you don't even see it, like the fish in the water. And so I inculcated that. Thought, yeah, I think that's right. But then by the 90s, when we were publishing Skeptic magazine, that's when it took the turn that you describe in one of your chapters as this sort of attack on objective knowledge. Because once you admit just a crack in the door there that science is not this this perfectly objective form of truth validation, then anything could go. It's all subjective, and then you end up at relativism. And that's an example of a kernel of truth going too far.
Yes, precisely. I mean, if we look back at scientists, they have been flawed human beings, and this is really inevitable. So Newton, as we know, wasted a significant amount of time trying alchemy. But how was a scientist in his era supposed to know what would work and what wouldn't work without this having been thoroughly tested already? Darwin wrote a letter saying that he didn't believe that women were of equal intelligence to men. And he was speaking at a time where he did not have evidence to see women succeeding in professions, and he's speaking with the cultural assumptions. So science obviously begins with cultural assumptions. But the good thing is that when it works on them and when it tests them, this is when we find out that they are not true. This is when we find out that men and women's intelligence on average is the same. Our ability to reason is the same. That we have some differences in interests and a few differences in cognitive abilities, but generally there is no scientific basis for claiming women to be less intelligent than men. So this is a discovery of science. And what the postmodernists tend to do, and particularly Michel Foucault, is to start at the end of the 19th century and just kind of stick there. And that's why we call it cynical. So Foucault, a gay man himself, he looked at the sexologists of the late 20th century who were regarding homosexuality as a disorder. Now, this was actually an improvement on the previous understanding of homosexuality as a heinous sin, but it was still obviously incorrect and extremely offensive. So there's that current of truth there, that in society there have been different narratives about what homosexuality is. It's a sin, it's a disorder, some people are gay, get over it. And the idea that the liberal would have is that this represents progress. Having got from believing homosexuality to be evil and then to be disordered to it being morally neutral variation of humanity is progress. But the critical theorists would use these different understandings in different times as evidence that knowledge is socially constructed. They don't seem to believe that you can get more right in understanding how people work.
Yeah, in graduate school, we read Foucault's Madness and Civilization. I think it was the first paragraph. He says he wants to turn the clock back to when madness was invented. And at first I was kind of offended by that because I had a schizophrenic aunt, and I've worked in a mental hospital, Camarillo State Hospital, when I was in college, taking an abnormal psych class. These people were obviously not just socially constructed. They had severe brain problems. But then when I read him a little more carefully, I thought, okay, he's making a different point. Yes, of course, there's people there's great cognitive diversity, as we might say today. They have some brain chemistry issues here. But what society does with them and how they talk about them and how they treat them, whether, as you said, as a sin, therefore they're immoral, or they're broken, and therefore we're going to lock them up in one of these dreadful mental hospitals. Whereas, say, 1,000 years ago, my aunt, she ended up living in a car in downtown L.A., despite the efforts of my mom to help her. Maybe 1,000 years ago, she would have lived on the farm with the whole family and had some little task she could do and lead a relatively fulfilling life without being medicalized as they have been since then. So that was his point, which I think is probably a fair point.
I mean, we look at different ways of understanding mental health, and I think, there is always that kernel of truth in there. Now, I consider myself to be very lucky. I am a fan of your book, The Believing Brain, because I found that extremely helpful to me. I am somebody who suffers from temporal lobe epilepsy. This causes some strange experiences of deja vu, of believing that I know what's about to happen, of feeling a presence there. So I suffered from hyperreligiosity until the cyst in my temporal lobe was discovered, and then the explanation for what was going on is happening. So in my time, my symptoms are understood as neurological. In earlier periods, in my period of study, medieval time, I would either have been seen as possibly a prophet or a mystic, somebody who actually had communion with God, or I could have been seen as a witch. So, we have, culture is extremely powerful on how we understand things, but that doesn't mean that there isn't actually a truth. The reason that I have the experiences that I have is because there's a cyst that's pressing on my temporal lobe. We know this now. This is the right answer. The witchcraft or the spiritual mystic explanation are wrong. we have the right answer. The postmodernists and the critical theorists that followed them didn't believe in right answers. Now, the people we see right now, like people like Robin DiAngelo, they do believe in right answers, and they believe that they have them. They believe that these systems of power and privilege, like white supremacy, are objectively real. They're objectively affecting non-white people in everything at all times, and that they need to be accepted and dismantled, that every white person has been socialized into these, and they need to acknowledge it. You can either be racist and work on it, or racist and in denial. So that really is an objective truth claim. It's come quite far since the radical skepticism.
Yeah, here you're speaking of Robin DiAngelo, who in her book White Fragility, she happens to be white. To people like that, I just say, well, speak for yourself. If you're a racist, then what's your problem? Because the rest of us have moved on. So sorry for you. But I want to go back for a second. I didn't know this about the cyst on your brain. Is it still there?
Yes. They apparently it's somewhat risky. They'd remove it in the US. You tend to take more risks, but no, they're going to leave it there unless it causes me significantly more problems.
And do you still get these feelings of deja vu and things like that?
Yes, but I now have a way of kind of ignoring them. I tried to test them as a young person. When I thought I knew what was about to happen, I tried to say it at the same time the person was going to speak it. I tried to sort of scientifically test and prove that I could see what was the future. And I couldn't do it, obviously, because what was happening was that the experience was making me double up my memory and making me think I'd experienced something before that I hadn't. So at this point, I still didn't know what was going on, and it wasn't until much later, and I had paralysis down one side, that I started reading more broadly. And then when I found The Believing Brain, it explained a lot. You and Sam Harris were particularly helpful to me.
Oh, well, thank you. Yes. Well, that's Francis Crick's book title, The Astonishing Hypothesis, which is that all of this stuff is just the product of brain tissue, and that we don't have to go to external sources, even if it feels like that, witches and demons and whatnot. So that's interesting. It reminds me a little bit of John Nash, who kind of overcame his schizophrenia. He mostly heard voices, though in the movie The Beautiful Mind, they made them visual hallucinations because it's a movie, not a soundtrack. But he managed to overcome it by just being aware. I know this is what's going on. I know it's brain chemistry.
Yeah.
And he took the meds for a while, but it kind of, they all have these terrible side effects. So he quit taking them. And then he kind of developed some kind of cognitive behavior therapy on himself of how to, navigate the world, even with these voices in his head, knowing that they're not real. So it sounds like you did something like that.
I kind of let them flit in and out of my mind now. I know if I'm having repeated deja vu, it's a symptom. I'm probably going to have a horrible headache shortly as well. But it's amazing the way the brain works. One of my friends was a schizophrenic, and of course, a lot of schizophrenics, he did have visual hallucinations, which, as you mentioned, are quite rare among schizophrenics. But he wished he'd see something like demons or something supernatural so that he would know it wasn't real, because he didn't believe in anything supernatural. But of course, because he didn't believe in anything supernatural, that wasn't what he saw. He saw things that could be real. He would come into a room and he saw a dead body in the room. He would see an angry dog and run from it and almost get run over. And I find brains, I'm not at all, I'm much more interested in the humanities and in culture, but neuroscience I have developed quite an interest in.
Yes, well, I can see why now, and that's probably a self-preservation as well. Yes, well, again, back to the wait, I was going to say something else about. I was just reading Simon Baron-Cohen's book for a future podcast. It's called The Pattern Seekers. So Simon's an expert on autism. So his new book, he puts out this pretty big thesis that most of the creativity in the arts and sciences and music and whatnot in human culture is the result of these super pattern seekers, these people that can find patterns and systematize them into new patterns, new systems of music, art, architecture, science, whatnot, and that this is an autistic trait. But the problem is that we have this word, autism, that's now a label. And to get say insurance coverage, you actually have to have a medical diagnosis, and a doctor writes a script and says, yes, he has been diagnosed as autism. Here are the treatments for it or whatever. So the doctor can get reimbursed by insurance, and you don't have to pay for it, the parent or the autistic person themselves if they're adults. And therefore it's medicalized it. But in fact, he looks historically at people like Thomas Edison and maybe Steve Jobs and others that, they were probably just on the autistic spectrum. But even that is still kind of medicalized. Well, you're on the spectrum. Oh, sorry. That's too bad. No, not sorry. This is a good thing. And you may recall in The Believing Brain, I contrasted John Nash with Richard Feynman finding patterns, and maybe it tips over into madness. Maybe if everything is a pattern and feels real, but there's some balance.
Yeah, I like the work of Thomas Clements on this, because I think that there is a fine balance to be found here. Now that there's a lot of people on the spectrum in my family, and my daughter is considered atypical, and she can code, and she doesn't understand why any of her classmates find coding at all difficult. It all just seems so completely obvious to her because she has this systemizing mind. I can't code. I've no idea what she's talking about. But then, of course, what's happened is that while for her and for my father, who is a very successful businessman because of his systemizing brain, that we could refer to them as neurologically atypical if we had to, and not as any kind of disability. But the problem with the neurodivergency movement is that they've pushed this so hard that it has really disadvantaged people who suffer from autism to an extent that they're not able to communicate or care for themselves. And this has affected their ability to get help and their carers' ability to get help, because it is now seen as problematic and ableist to say that a human being who isn't able to communicate or feed themselves is actually a disabled person who is requiring of help.
Yeah. Yeah, here I want to refer to my friend Nick Gillespie, who's one of the editors of Reason magazine. He's a libertarian, And he made a video on kind of defending postmodernism, in which he cites Jean-Francois Lyotard as defining postmodernism as, quote, incredulity toward meta-narratives. And then Nick continues, which means that you don't take knowledge or assertions of knowledge as a given, but rather you understand that knowledge and wisdom and even scientific understanding of things is not something that you're walking around and you discover in the backyard you stumble across, like you stumble across the Grand Canyon or a mountain or something. Rather, it's something that's produced by humans, and as a result, it's contingent, it's limited. Incredulity toward meta-narratives means that you're skeptical of these big stories that we tell about. Well, this is the way the world is and why it is the way it is and so on. It's always been that way. This is why it will happen and so on. Or alternatively, this is why the world should be this way, which just happens to comport with what I want. I see that phrase, continuing Nick Gillespie here, incredulity toward meta-narrative, as very simpatico with libertarianism. And it's very simpatico with something like public choice economics, which James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock, as the founders of it, called politics without romance. What it does is it looks at what is being said, why it is being said, who benefits, and whether or not it actually holds up to scrutiny from a kind of 360-degree angle.
Okay, so I could, and I'm not going to because I'd make you and all your watchers lose the will to live, but I could compare Foucault and Hayek to a significant extent.
Yes, please do.
They
yes.
kind of come at the same thing, the same sort of suspicion of reason, which is that is a skeptical position to take. The problem is when one is radically skeptical. So this is why we called our book Cynical Theories. We don't think that what they are doing is skepticism. There were skeptical methods which emerged in the modern periods, and science was the best one of those. This idea that you take an accepted truth and you test it, that's a kind of specific skepticism. So Sokal and Brickmont, they define this very, very well in Fashionable Nonsense, where they say the difference between a scientific skepticism, when you're asking how do we know if this is true, and then you think of ways that you could find out if it isn't true by trying to show that it's not true. And if you fail enough times to show that it's not true, you can be more confident that it is true, but never completely confident. Now, that is skepticism to meta-narratives, isn't it? That's a healthy way to do skepticism to meta-narratives. But if you go into the radical skepticism of the postmodernists, as Sokal and Brickmont say, it's just not very interesting because you're getting to the point, well, we can't know if anything's true, so let's not bother even trying, and we'll just look at why things might have got socially constructed in this way in the first place and then make theories around it. And so that isn't particularly helpful. So, yeah, I think if you're looking at that, libertarians certainly would have some sympathy with some parts of Foucault because they're very much compatible with Road to Serfdom by Hayek, where we're saying we need to be careful of propaganda, of language, of how it's used, of too much certainty. But I think both libertarians and postmodernists stray into cynicism and distrust, where there actually is more room for hope and for a productive scientific effort to get gradually less and less wrong.
Yes, since you mentioned Hayek, this is Friedrich Hayek, his famous book, The Road to Serfdom. So here, his skepticism of a grand narrative and reason is that using reason, a sort of central organizing committee or government, or say central economic bureaucracy, can control the economy, can determine what the right prices should be, what a fair wage should be, and so on, from the top down. And Hayek's point was that that's too much hubris. Nobody understands reason and complex systems well enough. We're not omniscient, and you'd have to be essentially to do that. But the marketplace can do it from the bottom up. Say, for example, since you're in London, how many bagels do Londoners need between noon and 1 o'clock today? Well, there's no possible way for the British government to figure this out. But you all can figure this out just from the bottom up. Just every little bagel store knows, well, I'm going to get 200 customers in the next hour, so I better have 400 bagels ready to go, because that's their history at that corner, at that particular shop. But other shops have maybe half that many or twice that many. And that was Hayek's point.
Yeah, I think this can go too far as well. I think there are arguments for some government limitations on markets. I just finished reading Ian Dunt's The Way to be a Liberal, and he speaks. I've always considered the difference between my liberalism and that of someone like Hayek, of me being a left liberal and him being a classical liberal. So Dunt refers to it as an egalitarian liberal versus a laissez-faire liberal. So there are historical examples of when excessive state control has resulted in complete collapse and starvation. And there have been examples of when a totally laissez-faire situation has resulted in monopolies and exploitation. So we humans who are living in a liberal society will really just have to keep arguing forever, probably, about how to balance what the regulation of markets. And the answer is probably not for them to be entirely free or for them to be entirely controlled. So I think probably both the Marxists and the radical libertarians are utopians. And the truth is somewhere in the middle, and I'm going to lean towards the socialists a bit more than you, I suspect.
Definitely more than me. But the point is, I think you're making the deeper point, is that you need both of these ends to push back against each other, which is why I'm always quoting John Stuart Mill that we need two viable parties. We have a duopoly here, particularly in America, because it's winner take all. So you end up with two parties. That someone like a Trump, I like a good central, modest Republican Party. I'm not a Republican, but I want them to be a good solid to push back against the far left, or they'll go crazy. And that when you throw Trump into it, it's like the Republicans have lost over here, so people have to go the other direction. Maybe they go too far. Just to stay on that example, your concern, I would guess, would be if someone like an Amazon came into London and said, all right, we're going to deliver all bagels for half price, and we'll give you free delivery right to your door. And now all the bagel stores go out of business. And then Amazon says, by the way, we're now doubling the price, and we're going to open up our own Amazon bagel stores. That would be too much power in the hand of a corporation.
Yeah, I think so. And you obviously, I think a problem in America is getting a monopoly on medications, for example. It costs an awful lot of medication in America. From what I know, I have to admit, economics is not my strength. So I think, we need some regulation. But I'd have to say I'm an ex-socialist, because this makes intuitive sense to me, from each according to his ability to each according to their need. That makes sense, but it doesn't actually work in practice. So we have to work with human nature rather than against it. And in that means we need, I think, to embrace the fact that we are both competitive and cooperative animals and try to get the best out of that. And I think we're not doing too badly at the right now. I mean, we still have here unaffordable housing, and we have children reliant on food banks. So we still have work to do to make things better. But on a historical level, we are doing better than we ever have done before, and there's good reasons to think we can continue doing that if we continue to have a liberal approach to society. And I agree with you. I think the problem that we're seeing at the moment is that the sensible, ethical conservatives are not pushing back at their sort of populist post-truth nationalist types strongly enough because they're too worried about the far left and the social justice activists, and then the liberals on the left are not pushing back at their extremists strongly enough because they're more worried about the rise of populist post-truth on the right. And then we're having this problem in the end where we haven't got any grown-ups left to talk. And so this is James Lindsay and I, we wrote a piece called A Manifesto Against the Enemies of Modernity. And we urged right-wing people to oppose the anti-truthers and the pre-modernists on their own side, and the people who lean left to oppose the postmodernists and the cultural relativists and epistemological relativists on their own side. And then, only then, when we have sensible grown-ups on each side making sensible arguments, can we even hope to achieve this balance, which I really do think we will have to argue about forever.
Yes, to use a current example of QAnon, I'm working, my next big book is on conspiracy theories. And I've been thinking about what it means to believe a conspiracy theory. So the QAnon thing has been an interesting example because it's so crazy, that there's this satanic cult of pedophiles. It infiltrated the U.S. government and being run secretly by Hillary Clinton and Tom Hanks and other Hollywood celebrities. And they're drinking the blood of children to live forever. And I mean, it just goes on and on. How can any intelligent person possibly believe that? And I'm thinking that they actually don't believe it. They're kind of nodding what Daniel Loxton, who does my Junior Skeptic, calls winking belief. Like his example is some non-trivial percentage of Icelanders say that they believe in fairies. Wink, wink. They don't really believe in fairies. It's just sort of a cultural tradition. This is what we believe in, like saying I believe in Santa Claus or something like that. So when someone like a Ted Cruz, who's, I don't like Ted Cruz much at all, but he's obviously not a dumb guy. He's a bright guy. He can't possibly believe that there's a satanic pedophile ring in the U.S. government drinking the blood of children. He can't possibly believe that. So when people like him say, yeah, there's something to this, I think maybe they're signaling their tribal loyalty. Like, I am so dedicated to my party that I will publicly say I believe this ridiculous claim. That's how devoted I am. And maybe everybody kind of goes wink, wink.
Yeah, I think that, Jonathan Haidt looks at this best, and I quote him repeatedly when he says that what we have is not an inner scientist, but an inner lawyer. It has served us better to work on shared narratives. So, yeah, I think we have done well in recent years to create and maintain an expectation that truth claims will be evidence and that reasoned arguments will be given for positions. And that is currently being undermined. So we are seeing, I'm not as familiar with QAnon as you are, obviously, but that is quite obviously clearly insane. But if we're having these, I'm familiar with a lot of sort of populist right-wing narratives that I will often be told, quite often by Americans actually, that my town, London, is now completely taken over by Muslims and that there are no-go zones in it. And, I live here and that's not actually the case at all. There 5% of the population is Muslim. We have an extremism problem and we need to deal with it. This is the actual reality. But the theory that builds up around it, that everything is going to be taken over, that's, I think, the narrative that people want because it brings them together. And then I think, yes, we see this on the other side as well. And this is where I'm going to make myself very unpopular, because I have some sympathy with gender-critical feminists who keep getting no-platformed at the moment. But some of the most extreme radical feminists from that branch, they really will insist that we live in a rape culture, patriarchy, in which it is absolutely normal and accepted for men to rape and beat women and that's it's a social norm. Nobody has pushed back at this. It's completely acceptable. Now that doesn't relate to the reality at all. Violence against women is consistently punished more harshly than violence against men. People feel more anger about it because of a strength difference, obviously. But they really do believe themselves to be living in this world where there is this force called patriarchy, which has kind of taken over the souls of men and made them derive pleasure from torturing and exploiting and violating women. Now, this is a tiny fringe group of radicals, and I have to say, a lot of gender-critical feminists are much more reasonable, and I have respect for quite a few of them. But those who have this conspiracy theory mentality on the fringes, there, I think it is about sisterhood. I think that it's about having found a niche where you can tell each other these stories, you can feel united in this battle against good and evil, and you've got a community. So I think you're probably right. I don't know if the wink thing is right. I think people delude themselves before they delude everybody else, but I certainly think they're telling stories.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe they come to believe it. Self-deception is very powerful. Bob Trivers wrote a whole book on this. Deception and self-deception. You're better at deceiving others if you believe the lie yourself, because you're less likely to give off tells that you're just winking belief that you actually really believe it. And that could be what happens to members of cults and extremist ideologies. Here I just thought of Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage. I just had her on the show yesterday, probably post around the same time we post this. And, about these teenage girls that want to transition into boys. So I spent a lot of time explaining why I don't think they're doing that by just taking testosterone, because there's so much more than just testosterone. But then she stopped me and said, Michael, they don't want to be boys. They want to be trans. Trans itself is a thing. And you have a whole chapter on this movement in your own book. That it's a kind of identity, not maleness, because in this culture, why would you want to become male? We're the bad guys. We're the baddies. And so, but it isn't, they don't want to be boys. They want to be trans, because trans has its own, it's sort of like a sisterhood, but not its own social culture.
I've read Abigail's book, and I found it very interesting. I think she, towards the end, she makes some more sort of socially conservative advocacy than I would. But I think I don't think there's much doubt that there is a faddish craze going on. I mean, I was a goth. The generation after me were emos, the millennials, weren't they? So what is the countercultural sort of rebellious identity? I don't fit in. I'm that kind of self-exploration that teenage angst is produced from. What is that in this generation? I have a feeling that it's a queer identity, and I find this particularly worrying, because I also think there's strong evidence that some people are trans. They do have gender dysphoria. This is alleviated by transitioning. And what I think we're going to see happening if this fad, which exists at the same time as it continues, is that genuinely trans people are going to be harmed by this, because at the moment desistance after puberty is still very low. There's something like 97% of people a few years ago who said they were trans after puberty, said so forever. I think if it is an identity, a normal teenage thing where kids try on different identities, they're going to see a lot of desistance. We're going to see more skepticism against people who actually are trans, and it's going to set back a lot of progress that could have been made.
That's why your book is subtitled "And the Harm." why it harms everybody. It has a backfire effect. Well, but so Abigail's point is that, for using your example, when you went through your goth stage, when you came out of that, there was no permanent damage, right? It's just whatever hair and makeup and clothes that you wore to be goth. Maybe you painted your nails black. I don't know what. But that all just goes away in a couple of days. Her complaint is that if a girl starts taking testosterone, that's going to change her body permanently. Or worse, you get the surgeries. I never heard of the top surgery. It's like, oh my God, these girls can do this. Yes, there are states in the United States where it is legal for an underage, under 18 person to go to the school counselor or the school health center and demand testosterone, and they will give it to them without the parents signing off or even knowing about it. I mean, that's a prescription drug. To me, it's baffling that any of this could be legal. And there's going to surely be some massive lawsuits. But that's the point, that you went through your goth stage, but there's no damage there versus this new movement.
I didn't know until I read that book that quite often taking puberty blockers followed by taking testosterone results in permanent infertility. So that is obviously a very serious concern. And I think if we're looking at people, because the trans activists will often say that the fact that most kids who take puberty blockers then go on to take hormones, testosterone or estrogen, demonstrates that they were right. But I think if we think about how teenagers work and the ability of teenagers to have the self-knowledge and the humility to actually say, I think I might have been wrong about that. There's that pressure, isn't there, at this age to continue to assert your own self-knowledge against your parents, if necessary, or against society generally. And there are healthy reasons for doing this. This is part of maturing into an independent, free-thinking adult. But, I think that it has been hijacked by a rather worrying movement that is going to hurt a lot of girls particularly, and we won't really know the fallout of it probably for another 10 or 20 years.
Well, here, back to your book thesis, is that in that case, for example, Abigail is criticized for not acknowledging lived experience as a form of reliable knowledge. That is to say, I feel I'm X, therefore I am X, because that's my lived experience. You can't know what it's like to be me, so shut your mouth. This is who I am. And your point is that, hang on, not all knowledge is just lived experience. There's objective, that's subjective knowledge. I feel like I'm X. Okay, fine. But if you want to actually do something that can permanently change you, now maybe we should ask, is there some objective truth to that claim? And as you point out in pretty much every chapter of your book, this idea is I identify as is a form of this kind of lived experience epistemology, which is still internal and subjective. And this postmodern push against objective knowledge kind of led us to that position. And that's where the danger is.
Yeah, and I think people, particularly the postmodern and the social justice theorists, they try to divide things where you can either care about objective facts or you can care about how people experience things. And that isn't how humans work. Most often we are interested in how people are experiencing things. We will say to our friends, how are you? Because we want to know how they're feeling. We don't often go up to someone and say, what are you? Oh, I'm a 42-year-old man. We want to know.
Right.
And we read stories. Almost everything we do, whether it's video games, movies, books, we like stories about people. So feelings really are very important. But the postmodernists and the successive social justice activists will make it as though those of us who are believers in objective truth, who would have been called skeptics, those of us who are sort of quite active in the whole sort of new atheist thing, we are actually automatons who don't believe that feelings matter at all. facts don't care about your feelings. Obviously, I know Ben Shapiro is not a new atheist, but anyway, that kind of attitude, that isn't, they are creating that dichotomy. We can both, with the example we use in the book, is that, if somebody has lost their father to a heart attack, for most people, our concern is, how is she feeling? How can we help her through this period of grief? How myocardial infarctions actually work isn't of primary interest at this point. However, we do actually need to know how myocardial infarctions happen. So there is an objective knowledge about how hearts work, which sometimes we need. And there is people's experiences of grief, of having heart conditions that we might sometimes care more about. So this idea that you can only do one or the other is a false dichotomy.
Yeah, that's a very good point for sure. Couple of other examples. You'll see above my shoulder there. There's a cover of Skeptic magazine with Steve Pinker on the cover. So we did a whole issue on postmodernism. Are we living in a post-truth world? To which Steve said, even asking the question, "Are we living in a post-truth world?" means we're not, because there's some set of arguments you're going to use that we're living in a post-truth world. It depends on logic and evidence, which means you're not in a post-truth world. But anyway, my friend Steve Beckner, who's a screenwriter and one of my cycling friends, he's a very thoughtful guy. So I had him write the kind of in defense of postmodernism. And so he makes a couple of interesting points here. For example, in Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow's book, The Grand Design, they present this, what they call model-dependent realism. Here I'm reading from Stephen Beckner's article. In the history of science, we have discovered a sequence of better and better theories or models, from Plato to the classical theory of Newton to modern quantum theories. It's natural to ask, will this sequence eventually reach an endpoint, or will we continue forever finding better theories, but never one that cannot be improved upon? And so this is, this idea of, again, back to, science is this asymptotic curve toward the truth. Even the great Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow say, well, hang on, not really. We're all stuck in models. That's kind of a postmodern argument. And then he goes on and because he listened to the 4 hours of Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. It's just really difficult. Talk about what is truth.
Painful, and very painful.
And Steve thinks, yes, very painful to listen to. But Beckner makes the point that in fact Peterson is kind of a postmodernist, because he quotes Peterson saying, "Truths are always bounded because we're ignorant. There's no reason to assume that our current scientific view of the world isn't flawed or incomplete in some manner that will prove fundamentally fatal to us." And then Sam pushes back against that. So in a way, Sam is more of the absolutist and Peterson's more of the postmodernist, at least in that portion of the conversation.
Yeah.
So those are examples, I think, of legitimate debate about what is truth, and that the postmodernists do have a point there.
They have a point, but their points have always been made better by other modes of thought. So, yeah, for example, Jordan Peterson is a Jungian, and so they have a lot in common with the Lacanians, and this is a different kind of postmodernism. I did a thing once where I took a section of Maps of Meaning in which Peterson spoke about the effective truth of the mythic world. And I just presented it, and I said, who is this? Who wrote this? And people identified it as a postmodern text. And it wasn't. It was Jordan Peterson. But it's the same pragmatic, constructed by narratives approach to truth. And this is why I support him on his whole free speech thing, but I disagree with him very strongly epistemologically. The postmodernists get it right when they say that we can never be sure that we have achieved reality. We can only have models and try to read the world through them. But they didn't come up with that. This is something that scientists have come up with. This is essentially the scientific method, where you have a hypothesis which can never be proven to be correct. It can only be proven to be incorrect. That science, obviously I'm speaking of an idealistic scientist who isn't actually a fallible human who's emotionally attached to his or her own ideas. But if we're looking at how science is supposed to work, this is the good bits of postmodernism. That doubt that is this the best model? Is this being affected by culture? How can I know that this isn't actually a social construct? How can I find out that it's objectively true? So I think this is where I often argue that it isn't that there's nothing good in postmodern thought at all. It's that there's nothing original in it, which isn't also claimed by a more rigorous and useful way of thinking about things.
Yeah. I have Jordan coming on the podcast. He's got a new book out called Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life. I like Jordan. I think I share your perspective that I'm skeptical of his epistemology. I support his free speech, of course, and all that. Mm-hmm. I do think a lot of people need simple rules like that. Like, make your bed every morning, eat a good diet, work out every day, just set goals, have some structure in your life. And I think a lot of people need that. So to the extent that if we think of what he's doing as clinical psychology, that's a different kind of objective, different kind of knowledge than, say, experimentalists in psychology use. I was an experimental psychologist, not a clinical psychologist. After spending a semester at Camarillo State Hospital, it was just so depressing. I thought, this is just not for me to counsel people and help people in that sense. But that's a sidebar. But so to the extent that he says, channel your inner savior or whatever, if it helps somebody, okay, I'm glad that it helped them, whatever it is. But because when we say, does it work, we mean something different. Does it work for 60% of the people that tried talk therapy improved versus 80% who use cognitive behavior therapy improved? Well, then we can objectively say this form of therapy is better than that form of therapy. But that's a slightly separate question from, did you personally get help from going to the psychotherapist or reading Jordan Peterson, whatever? So here I make the distinction with Jordan. Like when he says, this is an exact quote, but, he seems to believe in God of some kind, and maybe the resurrection of Jesus, or, maybe Jesus is some kind of divine figure. Metaphorically, so you say, well, did Jesus exist and was he crucified? I think we could make objective historical truth claims about that. He probably existed. Romans crucified practically everybody for anything, right? So that probably happened. Was he resurrected from the dead? Now, here I would say it's a 100 billion to 1 odds of this happening, because 100 billion people have lived and died. Not one has come back from the dead, except maybe one. If you're Christian, you believe that. Now, maybe Jordan would answer, I'm not saying literally came back from that. I'm saying we should all bear our own cross. We should, be born again. We should rise up from our trials and tribulations and become better people. That would be kind of a metaphorical truth, right? It's true mythically or metaphorically, not objectively.
I think, is it Adam Watts? I'm not sure. My friend Mike Naina, he showed me this video, which makes a lot of things fall into place for me about the prickly people and the gooey people. And you talk about this in The Believing Brain as well, in a different way. That there are some people who are satisfied by thinking in very sort of prickly ways. They want to know the what, when, why, and how, and they get quite impatient with the people who want to sort of stand in the fog of mysticism and being ambiguous and like metaphorical stories. And I don't really think we have a choice about what kind of person we are. I am a particularly prickly person. I very, very quickly get impatient with people who start talking about metaphorical truth. And a lot of people have contacted me because they have found Jordan Peterson's work very, very moving, and that it's had a positive impact on their lives, and they want me to understand that and approve of Peterson more. And I can see there is objective evidence that there's an awful lot of young men who have found his work helpful. I can't actually do that myself. I would be pretending if I was to try to get into this mindset of metaphorical truth and narratives. But I will admit that I was wrong. For a long time, I think I was wrong when I got over the hyper-religiosity thing that came with the temporal lobe epilepsy. I became a very strong atheist. And I believed that humanity could get past religion if we could just persuade everybody that there was not sufficient evidence to believe in religion. Everybody would become much more reasonable and everything would be fine. I don't believe that any longer. I believe that there will always be people who are focused more on what is objectively true, and there will always be people who find fulfillment in narratives which provide meaning to their lives. And most of us are somewhere in the middle with a bit of both. But I believe there are these prickly people like me, and there are these gooey people like Jordan Peterson, and I don't think we can change that by force of will.
Yeah, let me come at it from a different angle. So in the United States, there's a popular self-help guru named Tony Robbins. And he just got a massive following. Thousands of people show up at his rallies, and they pay thousands of dollars each. I mean, he's a rich guy. And he helps people. Okay, how does he help them? Well, really basic stuff, even more basic than Jordan's 12 rules. And at the climax of his these weekend seminars he would put on, he'd have a fire walk. And so they'd build these big strips of burned wood and rake them out, and people would walk across barefoot. Well, we staged a couple of these firewalks in the 1990s. I did 3 firewalks myself without chanting positive thoughts or thinking any kind of Tony Robbins mantras, nothing. I didn't get burned. And so we did a whole thing at Skeptic about the physics of firewalking. It has nothing to do with positive thinking or anything else. It's just heat conductivity. It's not the temperature. It's 1,000 degrees. It's intimidating to stand there and think, well, I'm going to walk across. This is insane because it's hot. But it's not the heat. It's the conductivity. And that dead wood is a poor conductor of heat into your dead skin at the bottom of your feet. And therefore, for example, if it was metal, hot metal that was 1,000 degrees, you'd get burnt because metal is a good conductor of heat, whereas wood is a poor conductor of heat. Anyway, but in doing that, I see that we kind of missed the point of the firewalk. For Tony and his followers, it was, I did this amazing thing. It's a metaphor for life. If I can walk across hot coals, I can ask for a raise at work. I can improve my sales calls. I can make more money. I can improve my marriage. And so on and so forth. And so it's like, okay, I guess I get that as a different kind of knowing.
Yeah, I just think we need to keep these ideas in the right places. So, if we have people who are very sort of interested in these metaphorical spiritual stories that are empowering and have great meaning to them, then we need them to be artists, and we need them to have jobs where they work with people and they put out their positive energy in this kind of way. We don't want them working out economic policy or being physicists, or we want the prickly people, the people who are skeptical, who think in terms of what is true and how can I tell whether it's true, to be in those kind of realms. But I do think it's a mistake when people think that they can talk each other into being a different kind of person. One of my oldest school friend, she's Muslim by culture, but by personal belief, she's much more sort of new age, spiritual kind of person, and she tries to convince me that my way of looking at things, where I like to pull things apart and write quite analytically, I don't need to do that. I can accept that I don't need to know all the answers. And then I have to say to her, well, actually, I do. I understand that you can't see any pleasure in what I am doing, which is trying to look at where logical reasoning has broken down, where something isn't epistemically adequate to make a claim, I can see that has no interest for you whatsoever, and that's fair enough. She works with children who have got themselves into trouble and in a system to try and prevent them from going into prison. So, she's doing really great things. But I can't adopt her mindset any more than she can adopt mine. And I think at times we're going to see this, and we can bring it down to enlightenment versus counter-enlightenment thinking. But I think we can try and avoid making too much of a conflict of this. So I think I was having a conversation with Brett Weinstein, and he was thinking towards the idea of compromise at one point, where, say, religious people could say, a lot of our beliefs aren't literally true, and then atheists could say that religion does have value, and their common ground could be found there. I don't think compromise like that can really work, and I've just oversimplified Brett's views hugely. He obviously gave it a lot more thought than that, but anyway, I think what we need to focus on is a society in which people can believe completely different things, and that's actually okay. We don't need relativism or compromise. We need pluralism. We need for people to accept that each other are different, and they can argue about it if they want to, or they can just be left alone and leave each other alone.
Yeah, here the problem again is this subjective versus subjective truth. What is truth? What does it mean to believe in something? I was thinking of Hans Weiner's, the philosopher Hans Weiner's concept of useful fictions. This is an old idea, but Yuval Noah Harari resurrected this as it were in one of his books, his first book, I guess, talking about like democracy or money. These are useful fictions. That money isn't worth anything. It's it's fiat money. It used to be based on the gold standard, so it was actually worth something. But now it's just an agreement we all make. This is the value of the money, or a liberal. It's a social construction. And I was thinking about that when you were speaking here about free will and determinism. And, so my friend Sam Harris, our mutual friend, he makes really good arguments for determinism. And then my friend, Dan Dennett, he makes, even to my mind, better arguments for compatibilism. And, I'm not sure this is ever resolvable in some objective truth way, that it's like, does anybody walk around making decisions in their life? Like, I'm going to the supermarket today. I think I'll do this, and then I'll go there and I'll buy this. And thinking about, am I determined? Is this some sort of volition in a compatibilist way? No, we just have this useful fiction. I'm free and you're determined because I try to influence you and you try to influence me. You assume you're free and that I'm determined, and vice versa. And that this is in this other realm of these kind of useful fictions to just function. Right. So,
I think that's quite right. I think the earliest person I saw writing about this was George Eliot. And she made a very similar argument to the one that Sam Harris made. And I come down on Sam's side with that, which is that, that free will may not actually exist, but acting as though it does exist is the way to actually function. And this is the problem that we have with the postmodernists as well. If you actually take their ideas to their full conclusion that everything is a social construct and that we cannot get the objective truth of anything, you just lie down and die, essentially. So we really have to... right. We're functioning creatures, and the majority of the time, even the most radically skeptical, cynical, objective, truth-denying person is doing a lot of things which show that they do, in fact, believe in objective truth. They're not. If they ask their child, "Have you washed your hands?" They know there's an objectively true answer to that or not. They're not going to say, your hands are filthy, but if you believe, if it's your experience that you have actually washed them, that's fine, pick up your lunch and eat it. No, they're not going to do
that. No. Now, my friend Martin, the late Martin Gardner, one of the founders of the modern skeptical movement, he had the Scientific American column before I did, and he was a really smart guy. I mean, he debunked all the psychics and astrology and talking to the dead and all, Scientology, and he was really one of the greats. But he believed in God, and he justified it based on William James's pragmatism and Unamuno's fideism, 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 which is justified belief if there's no way to resolve it. For only really three questions: God's existence, the afterlife, and free will determinism, human volition. And so his argument is that if there's no way to ever resolve it through reason or science or empirical knowledge or anything like that, and it's important, I mean, it really makes a difference in your life. Free will example: you can't walk around thinking you're determinism. You just assume you're making choices. And it can't be refuted, then it's okay to make that leap in a sort of Kierkegaardian leap of faith. Like, for me, it works to believe that there's a higher power. And Martin said this, even though he said, because he wrote books about atheism and theism, he said, I think the atheists have better arguments than the theists do, but only slightly better. And we can't prove there is no God, so it's okay if it works for you, to believe in God, believe in an afterlife, believe you have volition.
Yeah, I think we have to let people essentially do what does feel right for them. We just don't want them to do any kind of social engineering based on it.
Well, yes, right. If you say, well, we're going to teach this in public schools like creationists do, then I would say, hang on, no. Because you don't have evidence that there is a creator and that he used the intelligent design theory to create life or whatever. That's a different claim than it works for me personally. Again, it's this kind of collective action from the top down versus just sort of internal subjective truths for myself. Obviously, we have to make that distinction
as well. Yeah, I think all of us, even the most skeptical, and I do think I am one of the most skeptical minded people. We all have some understanding of the will to believe. So for me, for a long time, what I would really, really love to believe in would be the Loch Ness Monster. So I know that it's extremely unlikely, but I read an awful lot, and I went and sat by Loch Ness, and I looked at it for ages, and there are some hypotheses which aren't completely impossible, such as that a form of dinosaur did actually survive the extinction, and they do live at the bottom of the loch, which hasn't been properly mapped yet, and that but it's very, very improbable that such a small group bodies would never have been discovered ever. But there's something exciting, there's something satisfying about that. So I can understand why, I want to believe in the Loch Ness Monster. Does the Loch Ness Monster exist? Almost certainly not.
Right. Yes, I've told this story before of Richard Dawkins and Ken Miller. Ken Miller is a world-class biologist who specializes in cellular biology or whatever. And he wrote the first debunking analysis of the intelligent design irreducible complexity argument about the bacterial flagellum. It's a super like the sperm little tail that spins around. It's this complex molecular machinery. Could not possibly have evolved stepwise because you need all the parts in place, ergo God. Anyway, so he refuted this, but he's a Catholic. And so at the end of his book, the last chapter of his book, I forget the title of his book now. Sorry, Ken. But anyway, it's a great book. And but at the end, he says, but I'm Catholic. I accept the resurrection. Jesus died for my sins, and so on. So I had a conference with Richard Dawkins and Ken. Dawkins kind of pushed him on this. Okay, if we found a piece of the true cross, and on a piece of the true cross was a little flesh, and that's Jesus's flesh, so we extract his DNA, would he have a full complement of DNA like you and I? But he was supposedly born of a virgin, so he can't have that. And Ken saw where this was going. It's like, Richard, I'm not claiming this is true. in a biological sense. It's just what I believe as a Catholic. And it's an interesting moment there. It's like, it's kind of the end of the conversation, right? Yeah. There's nowhere else to go.
I have this conversation with my mother quite a lot because she tends to lean towards believing things because she likes them, and we get into conversations, and then I say to her, but you have to give me some reason for this. Make some kind of argument. And she says, no, I don't. Oh, okay. Oh, we're done now then. That the conversation is over. And I think we need to respect human nature and human needs. And this means that there are going to be people who are going to find fulfillment in believing things that probably aren't true. And it's going to make them feel happier. It's going to make them approach life more positively. And they have the right to do that. And then I have the right to think that they're wrong and say so and argue with them if they want to argue with me. If they don't, they can be left alone and live their lives out. I think we just have to try and work with human nature. We really are quite irrational apes who function on stories.
Yes, well, yeah, so the evolutionary psychologists studying literature are making this point that there's certain themes that come up over and over in classical literature because they're true. Not true in the story, but true in our human nature. Love and passion and jealousy and violence and hierarchy and power and competition for power. These are the elements of classical literature that come up in Shakespeare and Jane Austen over and over and over because they're true. I got in trouble
for that. In kind of I tried to do that. Yeah. I used Jonathan Gottschall and David Buss because, we wanted to argue about why would Desdemona be attracted to Othello and Othello to Desdemona. Now, Othello is he was a general. He was a successful man with many, many resources. Desdemona was a young and beautiful woman. Now, it was expected that you make a socially constructed argument about something to do with patriarchy and racism if you analyse Othello. But in fact, women being attracted to men with many resources, high status, and a much respected soldier is quite explainable by a lot of the work done by people like David Buss. And Othello being attracted to a very beautiful young woman is also quite explainable by evolutionary theory and the idea that the reality that beauty is associated with health and thus fertility is, this probably explains it. And I got into trouble for that piece, which I eventually published on Aereo. Instead, that paper was got an absolutely terrible grade at postgrad. And I was told that I was destining women to some horrible beauty myth, and that I was also offending African Americans by suggesting that race probably didn't matter quite as much as Othello being a very distinguished person in society.
Yes. Well, I do want to ask Jordan if that's what he means to do when he talks about Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, and he spends a lot of time on classical literature, and he's a Jungian, as you said. But Jungian archetypes. Of course, we skeptics don't think there's anything actually floating out there in the ether as an archetype, but maybe that's what Jung was doing, not knowing any evolutionary psychology in his day. Something like these eternal truths in human nature that it get expressed through literature.
I think so, and there's been some wonderful some stories. Now I can't remember names, but there was a sociologist who went and told the story of Hamlet to a group called the TIV, who were, I can't even remember where they were, some part of Africa, and she wanted to see how they would respond to the story of Hamlet. And she showed that they thought so differently to Western people that this proved that there wasn't a human nature. Now, an evolutionary psychologist went back over her information And she found out that this wasn't true. They had the same concept of, you know about this story? They had the same concept of of the supernatural. They they understood Hamlet perfectly. They responded in the way Shakespeare would have expected them to. There are some differences there. Whereas in the Christian tradition, Hamlet was wrong to kill his uncle before he'd confessed his sins and repented. For the Tiv, Hamlet was wrong to kill his uncle because he was an older male relative, and that was disrespecting the family line. So that's a cultural difference. But otherwise, this completely different culture understood Shakespeare and responded emotionally in the same way as Shakespeare expected people to do, and as we still do.
Since you said you're pretty far left leaning politically, you're a liberal. Let me just make a counter argument. Conservatives might take that example you just gave and say, you see, believing in a hierarchical structure, kind of a more conservative worldview in which an authority or a strong parent guides children through this tumultuous period of their adolescence, and that having rules and authority is a good thing because human nature is such that we will sin, we will err. They'll call it sin. We'll err on the side of evil or badness or whatever words we want to use, and so you need that kind of conservative worldview. Men are always going to want more sex than women. Women are going to want to withhold it. So we should have rules about that. We should have, sort of chastity and making, young couples wait until they get married. I'm kind of making a conservative argument along the lines of maybe what an evolutionary psychologist might say. Yeah, this is so Christianity, in a way, Christianity sort of got it right, even though they used the wrong terminology, sin or whatever. But in a way, the conservative argument has some basis to the true nature of human nature, and that's a good thing.
I certainly think that that conservatives are human, and they obviously they a lot. They have the same. They have. I'm quite convinced by moral foundations theory of that conservatives have a more even distribution of a lot of moral intuitions that humans have, while what he would call liberals and I would call leftists have a narrower one. So I test on this as more liberal than most liberals, but then I'm on the tradition one, which is conservative. I score quite highly on that, so it seems I'm a patriotic liberal, which doesn't really quite work. But I've had this argument made to me before that because a lot of what conservatives argue when they're arguing for socially conservative ideas, including against homosexuality and other things, because this is a natural human nature thing, then we can't really say that it's wrong. But I think that we can. I think that we can accept that human nature exists, and we can accept that it underlies sort of socially conservative ideas as well as very sort of individualistic ideas, and then we can argue for which of our tendencies we should maximize and which of them we should minimize. So I think we should maximize the equality and the care harm one. I don't see much value at all in the sanctity degradation one, which is when people are disgusted by homosexual sex or by women having multiple sexual partners. I don't see that as something that we should maximize as a society. And a conservative would respond to me that in a society in which women waited until marriage and then they had families, then the economy is better. There are perhaps better outcomes for children. We can make these kind of measurements. And then we come to an impasse because I'm essentially arguing for my moral system, which is always going to come down to the liberal individual in the end. I cannot accept that the collective should be given say over the individual. So I had a Saudi Arabian woman argued to me that the majority of Saudi Arabian women didn't want to drive. Therefore, this meant that there was no justification for allowing Saudi women to drive. And I would argue, no, if one Saudi woman wanted to drive and all of the rest of them didn't, she should still have this right. Now, this is a principle, and I'm arguing for individualism. And this is a human principle that comes from my moral intuitions, and they're different from another human with a different level, a different degree of moral intuitions, and perhaps a different background as well. But this is what I think makes us interesting as big-brained apes. You know, we're going to argue over these things. We're going to prioritize different things. What the conservative is prioritizing when he says, look how much better society works if we live in socially conservative ways, he's describing a society I wouldn't want to live in. So I have to argue.
Yeah. Well, I support your case. Methodological individualism is the basis of morality, I think. And that's, John Stuart Mill's all mankind minus one. The one should still be protected to have their thoughts and behavior, as long as it doesn't harm other people. That's a fundamental principle I think is pretty sound. Now, someone like, since we mentioned Abigail Schreier, I don't know her politics. Maybe she's slightly conservative leaning. And she gives an example in the book when she was a teenager, when she, reached puberty, her breast got large. And it was embarrassing that her father's friends were staring at her and all this kind of stuff that teenage girls have to go through. And that is bad. And at some point she went to her dad and said, well, I read about this breast reduction surgery. Maybe I'm thinking about getting that. And her parents said, no, you're not doing that. You are absolutely not doing that. And it was like, okay. And so her point of that story is that, teenage girls or anybody underage, say, for example, they're not really making rational decisions. They're not adults. This is why the Supreme Court of the United States decided in 2005 that capital punishment can never apply to someone under the age of 18. They're simply not capable of having volition in the way that we would hold somebody, say, who killed somebody at age 25, we would hold accountable and then they give all the scientific evidence showing that the prefrontal cortex is not completely online to control the bubbling up urges from the amygdala and the limbic system and so on and so forth. And here then I'm reminded of Heather McDonald, who, as you know, is a conservative leaning, but an atheist. So she's not bringing in God into the picture, but she makes the point that that kind of chastity and conservative values that women used to hold changed in the 60s with the sexual revolution, such that before that, when a young couple went out on a date, the default position on the part of the woman is, we're not having sex. Now, you can try to talk me into it. You can wine me, dine me, and charm me, and so on. And maybe I'll say yes, maybe, probably not. And so the guy's thinking, okay, it's probably not going to happen. So we're going to put that on the back burner. We're just going to have a nice date. But so in her take on this is that, by the 90s and the 2000s, this all changed. The default position is, we're having sex because everybody's having sex. This is big fun. It's all great. Friends with benefits. That's what it's all about now. So if a woman decides, I don't really want to have sex with this guy, now the burden is on her to convince him that the answer is no. And of course, the guy's pushing. And so you end up with this kind of flipped problem. And that's why we have this kind of backlash and this so-called rape culture. And then you throw alcohol into the mix and, all bets are off because there's no prefrontal cortex with alcohol. It's just shut off. So her argument is that let's go back to those conservative values because that actually is better for women.
I think you can certainly make that argument. I don't think, there's always people who are trying to make society see women in a certain way in order for it to be better for women. So most often I hear from feminists who want to get rid of expectations that women will wear makeup and high heels and get rid of these images. And then sometimes I'll hear from socially conservative women who say that motherhood is being disparaged and everybody needs to stop it. And I think we just have to kind of navigate our way through these arguments. I mean, my mother, she arrived in London in 1960 as a feminist, and right at the beginning of the sexual revolution. And yeah, she tells me that at this point it was, well, why won't you have sex? Are you frigid? This is, things are changing now. This is the age of free love, and it didn't suit her as a woman. She felt uncomfortable by it. She felt pressured into doing something she didn't want to do, and then she felt unhappy. And it was very unlikely that the man was feeling the same way. He was probably quite happy. And so, yeah, we take into account the fact that more women need to feel that there's some kind of commitment there before they are in the mood to have sex, whereas men don't. And this holds out across gay men and lesbian women as well. So we know that this is a sexual norm and not a cultural construct. Because men, when they don't have to work around women, tend to have quite a lot of casual sex with each other. So there's quite clearly differences between men and women, and we can make arguments certainly that a more sexually permissive society in which women are expected to have sex is not one that women that really works in women's interests. But I, again, as an individualist, I think we women are not as malleable and socially and susceptible to social pressure as people keep insisting. I think that I will encourage my daughter to say no if she doesn't want to do that. I think women can say no if they don't want to do things. I've studied that's what I study, late medieval, early modern women's religious writing. Believe me, when women don't want to do something, they are very capable of saying so.
Yes, indeed. It reminds me of Billy Crystal's character in that movie City Slickers, where it's the three guys on a horse trip, in which he says, "What is it? Women need a reason to have sex. Men need a place." And so this is kind of what evolutionary psychologists have discovered, right? David Buss, those surveys where they ask men and women, to what extent would you just have sex with the first person that you run into today? And, like 90% of guys will say, yeah, I'd have sex with a total stranger. And, 90% of women, or maybe 99% of women, say, no, I wouldn't do that. And but see there, the conservative might say, well, that's been the point of a conservative Christian worldview, or just a conservative worldview is that's in our nature. We've recognized that difference going back to biblical times. And this is why we have these rules that we think should be enforced. Now, what do you mean by enforced? Okay, so you and I would agree we don't want the government coming in and saying, okay, these are the rules. And but the conservative might say, okay, leave the government out of it. We're just talking about family structure and what fathers should teach children or mothers should teach their daughters and whatnot.
I think it's just social pressure. There's been a lot of arguments. Was it Jordan Peterson or was it someone else who said they should make it sort of socially enforced socially the sort of sexual monogamy? And I as a as a liberal woman, I would who tends to be combative and contrarian and generally enjoy arguing with people, I'd say you give it a try. You can certainly try and push this on women, but I really don't think they'll put up with it if it isn't what they want to do. If it is what they want to do, it's what they will do. There's a wonderful story about William de Swinderby, and I think he was in the 13th century, and he wrote a lot of sermons talking about the vanity and frivolousness of women, and so much he went on about this that the women of the village got together and they decided to actually stone him out of town. And he, in the end, had to kind of make a run for it and then come back and change and start talking about the evil of merchants. And I loved reading through this story because at no point was it ever suggested that the husbands or would stop the women if they didn't like this idea. And in fact, the writer, who was his contemporary at that moment, said the problem was with William of Swinderby not knowing when to shut up. So if we look back through history, we see women. This is what sometimes annoys me with feminists, but also with anti-feminists. We see increasing amounts of evidence of women doing, making their own choices about what they wanted to do. So if we see, and what we have mostly is sermons. That's what survived. Sermons that got hidden under churches during the Reformation. They're then found again. So it's sermons from the late Catholic period. They are telling women over and over again, stop drinking, stop swearing, stop going to wrestling and to cockfights, stay at home and don't argue with your husband. Now, the fact that there are so many of these that still exist telling women to stop doing this means that women were doing all of those things. The fact that
right.
it's
right.
You wouldn't be writing a sermon, and feminists, I think this is a naive take. Some of them have taken this, all these sermons saying to women, shut up, stay at home, be meek, as evidence that women were compelled to shut up, stay home and be meek, when really it's actually evidence that women weren't doing that. Otherwise, they would have stopped feeling the need to tell them.
Right.
So I get very, very individualistic. My husband is laughing at me. I get very individualistic about this, and I'm not sympathetic to the social pressure arguments. I think sometimes if you live in a small sub-community, for example, and all of your family and friends are very, very socially conservative, or something, perhaps a religious Christian, Muslim or whatever, then yes, it could be really, really difficult if you decided to be a promiscuous lesbian or something. But for the majority of us now, if we can make our own choices and we can find people who will support them, there is such a range of options for women now. I don't accept the idea that I'm either pressured into having children or pressured into not having children. Mainstream society is really going to provide me with plenty of friends, whichever I decide to do.
Yeah. Again, but the difference between, say, a sermon and a government decree or law is huge. So I'll give you three examples. I'm very conflicted on these issues, so you could give me your opinion on prostitution, polygamy, and pornography. So my inner libertarian propensities say, well, people should do whatever they want. They're consenting adults, as long as no one's harmed. Who cares? It's none of your business, Mr. Government. But on the other hand, then I see that a lot of these polygamous families, these young girls from the age of like 5, are kind of brainwashed into thinking you're going to marry that old guy down the street who's like 60 years old, and he's going to have sex with you when you're 15. And again, back to this, these are kids. They're incapable of making rational decisions. They're not consenting adults. And by the time they're, say, in their 20s, and you see these fun TV shows like Sister Wives, and the women are all talking, oh, I love, these are my sister wives, and we have this one husband. It's great. It's big fun. Yeah, but they were kind of brainwashed into that from a very early age. To what extent are they consenting adults? And same thing with polygamy, with prostitution. Again, sex workers, yes, they're adults, and if they should do whatever they want. But there's a lot of drugs and abuse and control And so, again, when the government comes in and says, you know what, you're not going to do that anymore because a lot of people are being harmed, I can see that there's a case for that. And the worst case, say pornography, worse in the sense I would not want the government to regulate it. But I can still see the argument that it degrades women, and young men are now growing up without actually having had sex with women, but thinking this is what women like, when in fact most women don't like what they're particularly watching on the screen. And it distorts things. And again, they're 14, they're 15, they're 16, and they have 10,000 hours of pornography in their brains and 0 hours of actual experience with women. And so I could see the case being made. Well, there needs to be some regulation.
I think that the best sort of comparison, and where people so often disagree, is with sex work and the hijab. So these are both. I think that there's an equivalent here. To what extent is this a choice? Has the woman chosen sex work freely out of, when she had a lot of other options that she could have taken instead, and that would have provided for her? Or is she doing this because she feels that she has to? She has too few options, and that's how she's going to provide for her family. The same could be said of the hijab or the burqa. Is this really freely chosen if everybody in your community is going to think that you're impure if you don't do this? Do we want the government coming in and saying, you're not allowed to wear a hijab because some women are socially pressured into doing it, and you're not allowed to do sex work because some women are socially pressured into doing it? I think in both cases what we need to do, and it's probably a charitable rather than a governmental affair, is to actually set up organisations in which women who want to escape these lives can actually do that. If they're not there voluntarily, then they can. I'm very that where I would say there's a difference, and where American libertarians would often disagree with me, is when it comes to guns, because they often put that in the same category as well, and that's yes. I think something that doesn't really fit in that category of it's a thing that I should be allowed to do if I am responsible and make my own choice, because we can't actually know who is going to be responsible and who's going to get drunk and shoot their toddler. So that's something I think is a little bit different. But generally, there isn't a simple answer. There are people who are going to live in communities that put a lot of social pressure on them. They're not going to be disagreeable people who feel confident enough to stand up to it, and they're going to make choices they wish they hadn't. And we can try to socially engineer society around them so that they have less of this pressure. But I think we'd do better to try to engineer society to encourage more individualism and resilience so that they feel more able to resist things. And I say this as somebody who has a particularly combative personality and has actually spent most of my life arguing with one thing or another. So I know that I'm not typical in the sort of Sam Harris free will type model. I didn't choose to be a person who liked to argue, but I am that kind of person, and it has worked out well for me. This isn't the case for other people or for other women. Social pressures are much harder to resist, but I still think we need to strengthen the individual rather than try to change society around the individual.
Yeah. Well, Helen, I want to keep this under 2 hours. I love talking to you. Our mutual friend Pete said you're one of the most interesting, smart people he's met, and he's right. But I want to cover race before we end this. Race is such a huge issue now. I've read the race books, the White Fragility, the Anti-Racism book, the Caste book, and then the letters Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi Coates' letter to his son. These were so depressing reading these books because basically the message is you stand no chance of succeeding in this racist hellhole of America or the Western world. To which I say, then how did your book get to be the #1 best-selling book in the world on the New York Times bestseller list, whatever? Somehow there is a way to succeed. I'm making a little bit of a joke there, but the race issue in America in particular was punched home to me, but from my wife, who's from Germany. So she came here 7 years ago, and she's just been stunned by how much race just comes up in conversations. It's on the news every night. It's every blog, every podcast, race, all these books, race. They have different issues in Germany, but race isn't one of them. And it's like, you guys are obsessed with race. You're obsessed with Hitler and the Nazis. Every other documentary is about Hitler and the Nazis. And race, black and white. Everything is black and white. Given our history, I can see it. But it just, and she keeps asking me when, because I keep telling her, don't worry, the pendulum's going to swing and all the woke, crazy progressiveness is going to go away, and race and gender and all this stuff, and we're going to get back to normal. And she keeps asking me, when's that pendulum swinging back? Because it doesn't look like it is. So I'd like to ask your thoughts on why the obsession with race. Are we going to get back to a really race neutral or post-racist society? We seem to be going in the other direction.
I think we are going in the other direction. I know with America, it's a special case that the founding of America did very much depend on the subordination and exploitation of one race for the benefit of certain members of the other. So that the racial history in America, I'm not surprised that it remains a big deal, and that it's not going to be something that can be just sort of overcome very, very easily. It is a huge issue, but I think that, yes, there was progress being made with what they call the civil rights discourse of Martin Luther King. And now the critical race theorists are very critical of what they call the civil rights movement's discourse. So, yeah, I think things were getting better, and they're not getting better now. We're at Counterweight. We're trying to help this with our first academic project is called the Black Diversity Project, and we're having Black intellectuals write a chapter on their favourite Black intellectual who dealt with issues of race and racism, and why they think their particular view was particularly helpful. And we want people from Ibram X. Kendi to Thomas Sowell, and try to sort of have this full range of ideas for myself. I think I read somebody like Shelby Steele, and he is a very much sort of pull yourself up by the bootstraps type. And I think this is probably a really good attitude for an individual to have. It's the most positive way to go into the world and affect good things in it as an individual. But there's the normal problem that conservatives have of not looking at the social issues. So I think then when we're getting into looking at social issues, this is when we need more sort of empirical scholars and more reasonable scholars. So I like Michelle Alexander. A couple of the claims made in her book New Jim Crow I know have been questioned, so I'm not accepting it uncritically, but she, I think, really is one of the more empirical scholars and practical minded, and I love Cornel West. So what I found particularly wonderful about him was when he wrote in his book, Race Matters, he said, my friend and fellow Christian, Glenn Lowry, and then he went on to say why Glenn Lowry is wrong about absolutely everything. And I thought that this is what we need. This is really what we need. And I've been looking at American racial history because that's where critical race is coming from. We need to get all of these people together with Cornel West's attitude, with Michelle Alexander's empirical focus, and with Shelby Steele's kind of sort of individualism, and try and have those conversations between them. And I think it's a shame that the critical race theory narrative is winning out, and when there's so many other black scholars out there doing really sound work on race and racism, and not sort of progressing the conversation.
Yeah, they. I know that people like Glenn and John McWhorter and Coleman Hughes have tried to engage with Kende and some of the others. They won't go on their podcast or talk to them. So I hope you're able to do that. I'd also recommend Jason Hill. He's on my podcast Saturday. We're releasing that this week, and he's very much along the lines of Thomas Sowell and Shelby Steele. I had Shelby on the podcast, and I said, "What about the argument that I can't lift myself up by my bootstraps if I don't have any boots?" To which he said, "Well, then make your own boots." Well, okay, how do you do that if you have nothing? Okay, well, yeah, well, then get something. That's very much that kind of rugged individualism.
I don't think Shelby Steele or Ibram X. Kendi are going to single-handedly solve the problem, but probably a productive conversation between them and everybody in between them is the thing that will, if you ever get to the stage of being able to do that.
Yeah, I have an article coming out in the next issue of Skeptic on by an high school English teacher railing against the defenestration of Huckleberry Finn and other classic works of literature because they use the N-word. So she writes here. This is Kathleen Schultes, and she writes, "The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is a tale of the triumph of the human spirit over slavery and its entanglement with every institution of American life, particularly religion and language. And it is language, specifically the word with which we must come to terms. At the heart of this debate lies this issue. Why would Twain knowingly deploy this word to refer to a community of people upon whose backs the American South was built? What possible defense might be offered?" And then, of course, she goes on to say the reason he used that word, the N-word, is because it's offensive and that he's against the use of it. And people that want to defenestrate or, just cancel Mark Twain must not have read the book because it's an anti-racist argument against the people that were using it. And that was a long time ago.
There certainly is a lack of moral complexity here. I think Alison Bailey, Privilege Preserving Epistemic Pushback, her essay covers that issue completely. A student who was white used that word while using quotes in order to talk about racism and was asked not to. And the reason that she was given was a quote from Maya Angelou about how people feel. So this was a philosophy class. So I think there has to be some kind of balance here where people are able to speak about certain things, but of course that word it does actually cause people significant amounts of pain. So I think in a lot of ways it's good to have taboos. We have taboos against things like paedophilia, and I'm not at all convinced by the non-offending paedophiles who, for some reason, email me and try to get me to take up their cause that we should take away the taboo against them. No, we'll keep that there. And I think we should keep the taboo against the N-word there as well. But if we can't look at history and how that word was used and, get that visceral sense of shock from it, that's surely, I think, something that will be more effective against racism than not reading the book.
Yes, I agree. Yes, I'm even uncomfortable saying it, just reading it. We put it in the article instead of N-word because the whole point that Twain was making in using the word is to rail against it. I'm still uncomfortable even saying it out loud. Printing it, I guess, is okay.
I think that's a good thing, Michael. I really do. There's the problem with people being too scared of things to say, but that actually having a visceral disgust and discomfort with the N word is probably a very positive thing.
Do you know Tim Minchin, the singer songwriter,
his
and
Ginger
his song "Prejudice" about the So for my listeners, just Google Tim Minchin, Minchin, comma Prejudice, and you'll get the song. It's really quite good. I'll just read some of the lyrics here. In our modern free-spoken society, there's a word that we still hold taboo, a word with a terrible history of being used to abuse, oppress, and subdue. Just 6 seemingly harmless letters arranged in a way that will form a word with more power than the pieces of metal that are forged to make swords. A couple of G's, an R and an E, an I and an N. Just 6 little letters jumbled together have caused damage that we may never mend. And it's important that we all respect that if these people happen to choose to reclaim the word as their own, it doesn't mean the rest of you have a right to its use. And then, and the song is very dark, and there's like a blue light on him, and then it switches to this red light, and he changes key to this kind of happy tune in which he says, let's see, only a ginger can call another ginger a ginger. And he says, so the N word is actually the G word, the ginger word. And then he does recount that, because he's redhead, right? He's a ginger. So he recounts what it's like growing up, and being, made fun of. And let's see, only a ginger can say, yeah, you can call us a bozo or a fire truck, a carrot top or a blood nut or a matchstick or a tampon. And, these are all the things he was called. And, it's hurtful. It's not as bad as the N word. Yeah. Ginger is not as bad as the N word, but it's also another way of dealing with it, I think, in using humor in a way to kind of diffuse the seemingly talismanic power of the word.
I mean, Mike Maynor has argued this. You know him, perhaps, that he's the filmmaker who's covered a lot of this, and he's mixed race. And yeah, he said he's not quite sure how to think. He'd suffered some racist abuse at school, and he takes this kind of pull yourself up by the bootstraps approach as well. And so he says, I don't think that me being called names like that was worse than the fat kid being called fat and the ginger kid being called ginger. And, but he was in Australia, and this was apparently everybody was insulting everybody, and there was some kind of camaraderie, even banter about it. But I think that's a healthy attitude to take if you can. But I do think America does have to have a reckoning with its racial history, just as the UK, we have to have a reckoning with the British Empire. We exploited we owned a third of the world, and millions of Indians died. I think there's a moral complexity in which we can actually acknowledge that America's racial history has been really, really horrible, and Britain's imperial history has been terrible, and we can also still beat this with liberal approaches and move forward at some point. I think too many people want to either hold on to grievances forever or just brush them under the carpet immediately, when there's actually probably a middle route by dealing with them. And I think probably reading Mark Twain is one of the ways to do that, to give people a sense of what things were like, and to feel that reaction, that kind of visceral, how could you use that horrible term, and to come to terms with it.
Yeah, you end your book by talking about, much of the book is critical of other things, other beliefs, but what is it you believe? So you have these affirmations. We affirm that racism remains a problem in society and needs to be addressed, but then we deny that critical race theory and intersectionality provide the most useful tools to do so. You continue, we affirm that sexism remains a problem in society and needs to be addressed. We deny that theoretical approaches to gender issues, including queer theory and intersectional feminism, which work on blank slatist theories of sex and gender, are useful to address it as we believe it is necessary to acknowledge biological realities to address such issues. We affirm that discrimination and bigotry against sexual minorities remains a problem in society and requires addressing. We deny that this problem can be solved by queer theory, which attempts to render all categories relevant to sex, gender, and sexuality meaningless. And you had a couple more of these here that I think are worth reading. Finally, we affirm that social injustice still exists and that scholarship on issues of social justice is necessary and important. We affirm the value of interdisciplinary theoretical approaches, including the study of race, gender, sexuality, culture, and identity within the humanities. We affirm that many of the ideas generated even by the reified postmodernism of social justice scholarship, including the basic idea of intersectionality, that unique injustices can lie intersected identities that require special consideration, are insightful and worthy of submission to the marketplace of ideas for evaluation, adaptation, further study, refinement, and potential eventual application. I think that's just a beautiful affirmation of and acknowledgement of the truths that a lot of this literature has produced, where it's gone too far, and what we need to do to get back into a bit more balanced state.
I keep talking. I think that's what we need to do.
Yes. Well, then I'll end with, I think, where you're probably going with your next project. Here I'm writing from an essay I wrote on a dream deferred, that is Dr. King's dream. Among his many elements, Dr. King's dream included his faith that one day we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. Man, he could sure write. Within our culture in general, and on social media and talk radio and television in particular, the jangling discords of identity politics are said to be pulling us into another civil war, this one cultural instead of martial. With discordance arising from these many identities competing for power and influence that have brought out the worst demons of our nature, it is prudent to recall the dream of a civil rights crusader from an earlier century, Abraham Lincoln, as his country was on the eve of a real civil war over the enslavement of millions of people who wanted nothing more than to be treated equally as fully human with the same rights and privileges as those enslaving them. Speaking to the Southerners who had already seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America, the great emancipator implored, here I'm quoting Lincoln, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained it, must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." Man, that guy could write. He also could write. And so can you, Helen Pluckrose. Thank you for your work. Thank you for this book. And your next book is, it sounds like this is going to focus on this very issue of race. So I hope that is a successful project for you.
It's been great talking to you.